What's up, gamers? Welcome to the third recorded session of the Rec Room Studio Basics tutorial class. I'm Cooks, and I'll be presenting today. And as always, any good qualities of this video are thanks to AKKR123. If you haven't checked out their channel already, you definitely should. Let's get stuck into it. But today, we are going over terrains. So I'm hoping you'll all find this as much fun to mess around with as I do. Alright, so the first thing we'll cover, when it comes to terrains, is you need to add one into your scene. We add a terrain into the scene just like we do anything else. From the hierarchy panel up here, we press the plus button, we choose 3D object, and we choose terrain. Now, when you first import a terrain, if we navigate through the incredible door that I'm sure you made for your homework, terrains always spawn at position 000, but they always extend also from 000. Which isn't always especially helpful, because that puts them way out to the front and to the left of your scene. So the first thing we normally do is reposition our terrain so it's sitting so that our existing level is sitting in the center of it. And to do that, we simply go into the transform panel, and we're going to set its X position to -500, and we also set its Z position to -500. So our terrain is now sitting roughly right in the middle of our map. So just briefly, I'll go over the terrain settings that it's helpful to be aware of. Now, don't worry if this panel looks intimidating. You don't need to know 90% of what's in here. I'm just going to highlight the one or two things that I think are helpful. So the terrain menu shows up in the inspector. It's a component just like anything else. And we have our 5 little submenus up the top where we'll be spending most of our time. But for now, we'll navigate to the terrain settings menu. And as you can see, a lot of these do look reasonably intimidating. We don't need to know most of these things. There are only 2 things in this panel that you want to be paying attention to. And that is here, our terrain height. This specifies the maximum height that your terrain can be. So your terrain is always set to 0 height by default. But it'll be a number between 0 and 600. And so if you want some really dramatic mountains, you can bump this number up to something like 3000. And it'll just get you that little bit of extra height. The only other thing that you'll want to pay attention to is your control texture resolution. I usually bump this up to at least 1024 by 1024. Now what your control texture resolution does is terrains let you paint textures on other textures, but there is another texture that actually dictates which parts of that texture show up where. That's the control texture, and by default its resolution is fairly low, and it means a lot of your painting can look a little blocky. So I wouldn't recommend setting this too high, but setting it to something like 1024 by 1024 can allow you to get a slightly nicer looking terrain. The only other thing to take note here is that you can also set the length and width of your terrain in the mesh resolution panel here, which you will want to do instead of scaling your terrain, because scaling your terrain does very strange things to the physics. That's all I'll say on that for now. So our terrain's looking pretty ordinary right here at the moment. We're sitting on a giant kitchen floor, which, you know, I like kitchen floors as much as the next person. But let's see if we can add a little bit more character to it. So from here, we're going to go into the brush menu of the terrain. This is where we'll spend a good portion of our time when it comes to dealing with the terrain. So the first one that's open by default is the paint texture. Now, if you open up your terrain panel and everything looks kind of funny, like if you select something else and then you select your terrain again, sometimes your menu will look a little funky. It'll look a little bit warped. So if you run into that issue, all you need to do is collapse the terrain panel using the little triangle drop down next to its entry in the inspector panel, click on it again, and it should reappear like it normally looks. So the first menu that we have for terrain is paint texture. This is a very useful menu. That's a lot of useful things you can do with it, but it's not very useful to us right from the get-go. You'll notice if you try and grab this brush and try and paint anything with it, nothing happens. That's because before we can actually paint any textures, we have to specify those textures. We do this from the layers drop-down, which is at the bottom of the stroke panel, and is collapsed by default. But if we click this triangle to open it, you'll see we have a little set of layer controls. So in order to actually paint any color on our terrain, we need to create a new layer. We do that with using the Create New Layer button down at the bottom here. Now, rather counterintuitively, no worries. Have a good one, Harrison. We specify the name of our layer before we actually create it. So you'll want to have an idea of what texture. So Freckle Layers is in the Terrain component menu under the Brush panel. And then if you scroll down to the second heading, which is Stroke. Actually, it's a heading of its own. Apologies. So go below Stroke, below Material, and there it's a Layers dropdown, which is collapsed by default. So to create a new layer, we need to specify a name. So just make sure that your little dropdown up the top, right below the paintbrush, click on that dropdown, and you want to set it to Paint Texture, second from the bottom. That's usually what it's in when you open it, but sometimes it isn't. So if it's got any one of these checked that isn't Paint Texture, open up that dropdown and set it to Paint Texture. Okay, so we'll bring that back up. Hopefully everyone can see that clearly, but there we go. So now that we've got our layer panel up, we can type a layer name into our Create New Layer dialog down the bottom here. I'm going to use Dirt for example instance. And when you do that, it's going to ask you to select a texture. Now the texture panel here will show up quite a few different ones. But for now, we'll use the assets that we imported before we started. And we're going to type Summer into the search field, because there's a certain set of textures in the flat texture folder that all have this name on them, and I think they look quite nice. So we can choose a nice sort of base layer. Since we called this one Dirt, I'll select a Dirt texture, and just double click on that one. And you'll notice as soon as you do that, that your entire terrain has now changed to have this texture on it instead. Now, just while we're on the topic of terrain layers, I just want to demonstrate something to you real quick. So your terrain layers actually live as their own assets. If you look in the layer palette, you'll see that we have that same little magical box with a circle on the end of it that we would for any other field that accepts an asset. And like any other one of those fields, if we click on it, it highlights the new terrain layer that we've just made in the inspector. So you may want to make a new folder in your project to keep the terrain layers in, but for now we can just keep them up here at the top level. But I want you to click on your terrain layer that you've just created real quick, and just notice that it has its own set of settings. So a terrain layer is kind of like a mini material. So we can actually assign it a diffuse map, we can assign it a normal map, we can set how shiny it is. Now this is one thing that you may notice. You may see that your texture is a little shinier than you might expect dirt to be. This is a studio specific error with the shaders. And the way that we fix it is by selecting our diffuse texture. So if we click on the diffuse slot on our layer, it'll bring up where that texture lives. And if we click on the texture itself, and we're just going to go up to the Input Texture Alpha section of that texture import settings. We're going to click it, and we're going to set it to none. And then we're going to move down to the bottom of this panel and click Apply. Now you don't always need to do this. And as you can see, nothing visibly changed too much in my scene, because I'm realizing what's making my terrain look a little perhaps shinier than it should is actually the fog, and not the terrain being shiny itself. But if you ever run into a situation where you import a terrain layer, or where you set a terrain layer and everything looks much shinier than it should be, that's how you fix it. And so now, you can see our terrain is looking a little more terrainy, but still if we click with our brush, nothing happens. That's because in order to actually, when we set our first layer, we set the default layer. So now we're going to add a new layer that actually lets us paint things on top of this one. So I'll call this new layer Grass. We'll click the Create Layer button again. We'll type Summer back into the search field. And we'll grab some nice looking summer grass. Now, as far as I'm aware, the ordering of your terrain layers doesn't make too much difference, but you can, actually no, I do believe reordering these can change the base layer. Yes, it does, okay. So whichever layer is at the top of your palette will be the base layer. And Unity will complain at you if you start to reorder them after you've painted. So generally try and keep these in the same order they appear in if you can. But you'll notice now that we have another layer, if we click on this layer to highlight it, and now we start painting, you'll see that we are finally starting to get some color variations on our terrain. And so obviously you can use this for all sorts of different pieces, like you can start painting yourself some paths, you can paint yourself some meadows, you can add all sorts of interesting little bits of variation. Now if you've got a good set of textures, they'll blend with each other fairly well. But often you want a little more fine-grained control over where your textures are going. And so for that, I'll now walk you through the brushes panel. So you'll notice that we have a few funny looking images here by default. And the first one we have selected is this big round circle. And you'll notice that when we paint with it, or when we paint with this one highlighted, our texture is going down in roughly a big old circular pattern. But we have a few other options available to us. So just for the record, you can actually import a brush, because a brush can be any texture, so long as that texture is just black and white. But for now, let's select something, just for the sake of the demonstration, let's select something like the star. Now the star, in this particular case, you'll notice it's moving around a little bit every time. That's because we have some jitter enabled on our brush. So if we look at our stroke settings, we've got a few different ones here. So we have brush strength, brush size, brush rotation, and brush spacing, but under each of those, besides brush spacing, we have a jitter. Now what jitter does is it introduces a little bit of random variation. So you'll notice how right now whenever I click mine, my star is changing angles a little bit. If I set that jitter back to 0, it's going to stay at roughly the same angle every time. You'll also notice it's not making much of a mark, because the star brush is very narrow. To change that, we can dial up our brush strength to have it have a much stronger influence on the terrain below it. And now you can see now this is one thing that you saw I just accidentally did. If you accidentally click on another object, you will lose your terrain menu. So it's definitely helpful to remember how to get to any given one of these. So again, to get back to this menu, paint terrain, paint texture. And if we click a few times, we're now deploying our texture in roughly a star shape. But you can achieve a couple of different, interesting different little effects, even with things as simple as brush strength. So if we dial our brush strength down to something very light, we can kind of paint a thinner layer around existing texture islands we've already set up to make that transition look a little bit smoother. But the other thing that so also obviously if you want to be able to paint a larger area, size is very useful because it will let you paint vast swaths at once. And rotation is not really necessary for circular brushes, but rotation is very useful for brushes that have a little more pattern variation to them. Because obviously you don't generally see the same shape sort of stamped in either color or shape of a real terrain again and again. And this just adds, if we set our rotation jitter up to something decent, you'll see it changes the orientation of the brush every time. But especially sort of noise, this is technically what we call a noise pattern. But brushes like this one are also very useful when you use them at a larger size. Sorry, I'm adjusting the strength. Because you can use it to make it look like there's some more color variation just by choosing a larger brush and just clicking. And if we dial up the strength for this one, you'll see that it kind of stamped a bit of variety in this texture across a fairly wide area. Obviously, you can import your own brushes and make all sorts of interesting sort of colors and texture variations with this. So I encourage you to experiment and see which sort of things work the best for you. So now we've added a little bit of variation to the color of our terrain. Not much just yet. But we may find that either we've done all the color work we want to do, or we can't do too much more color work until we actually give some definition to our terrain, until we actually, add hills and other interesting things that terrains have. So now I'll get you to switch from the paint texture drop down up the top here to the raise or lower terrain drop down. So paint texture and raised and lower terrain are probably tied for the most important controls we have. Now this is where brush images really come into their own, because the same principles that we saw when painting textures also apply when we're painting elevation, which is what raise or lower terrain does. So if we grab our big old brush and dial its strength into something decent, you'll see, oh hey, we've got mountains now. And you can stamp a couple of these in around the place, and they can add some interesting looking variation fairly quickly. But obviously, not all of our adjustments need to be this dramatic. But this is just a nice and easy way to see what kind of effect these brushes have. So we can dial down our strength. Now obviously you saw that we just raised the terrain. You'll see in the little header up here, it says click to raise, but hold Control and left click and you will lower. And so if I hold Control and click on this a few times, the terrain reduces in elevation. Now, do note that you cannot reduce the terrain's height below the base level. If you want to start your terrain at a given height and then move it further down from there, you need to use something like the set height and paint over the entire terrain. And then you can excavate into it from there. But from the base terrain settings, you can only raise it and then lower it, things that you've already raised. And so I'll give you a second to play around with those because they are definitely a bit of fun. There's a lot of things you can do with, like, sort of different strengths, different brushes, different sizes. And even more possibilities open up if you start importing your own brushes. I often find, like, sort of once you actually introduced a little bit more landform, that you might want to actually change the color of these now. And so you'll find yourself switching back and forth between the paint texture modes and the raise lower terrain modes quite often. So again, if we want to paint some grass on our hills, we can reduce our brush size down a little bit, go back to our layer, make sure we're painting with our grass, and just paint a little bit of greenery on the top of those. If we decided that we wanted to put a little bit of snow on our hills, we can always add an ice layer to our terrain. Type in winter on this one, for example. And if we now highlight another layer that we've created, we can paint this one onto the top of our terrain too. And you can see that having a few different ones of these at our disposal definitely makes it a little easier.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
And feel free to just ignore this question if you're going to cover it later. So, like, how do you avoid the terrain looking very tiled on the textures?
So this is an interesting problem. So there's a couple of different techniques we can use to avoid it looking overly tiled. One of them is, as I previously mentioned, we can kind of try and stagger our transitions a little bit by using a brush to apply that has a bit of variation built into it already. And we can kind of try and paint in. We can kind of blend between two different textures that we already have on the terrain. And we can kind of like sort of make textures that look like half-half. And to that end, you'll often also want to add multiple textures that already appear visually a little bit similar. It's like if we've got an ice layer already, but if we added a snow layer, and then we can kind of add, I realized I had the wrong brush selected there. But if we start to add little bits of our snow texture onto here, we can kind of blend them together and make them look a little bit less uniform, make it a little less obvious that it's like a single texture that's overlaying them over the top of one another. Another thing we can do to make the tiling a little bit less apparent is, depending on the resolution of your texture, you can change how much it gets tiled. And we can do that from the terrain layer settings. So in our we'll have a tiling size option here. And if you increase the tiling size of your texture, then it will repeat that texture fewer times across the terrain. But there's one other thing still that we can do to make the tiling a little bit less apparent. And that I will go over in just a moment. But thanks for that, Jeff. That's a really good question. Did anyone else have any questions about what we've covered so far? As you'll notice that we had a whole bunch of other options here besides razor lower terrain and paint texture. These are still the most common ones that you'll use, but you'll see that we have quite a few other things that we can do here too. Besides paint texture, they are all related to changing the shape of the terrain. But I do quite enjoy working with them. So one of my favorite ones is the transform and smudge modifier. Now, if you've used the smudge tool in any like image editing software, you'll find that this does roughly the same thing. But is that the smallest it's going to let the brush go? Oh, there we go. What the smudge tool does is it kind of lets you take the existing height of a terrain and just kind of flick it out a little bit. I don't have the strength set high enough here, but you'll see you can kind of use this to like lengthen a ridge or like bring in other landscape features, like make it look like mountains have like arms that sort of jut out, just by repeatedly sort of flicking over the same bit of texture again and again. And I often find it's a fun little way to add a bit of variation to things. Another one that I find quite useful is the bridge tool, which I believe lives under the sculpt. This one's an interesting one as well. Again, you can see my UI is glitching out. If your UI does glitch out, just be sure to collapse your terrain panel and then open it back up again. So again, we'll want a smaller size for this, but what bridge does is it lets you specify one point and then specify, oh right, okay, I have to control click to set the stop point. So it lets you set one point in your terrain. If you control click, then you can click another point on the terrain, and it creates a land bridge between them, depending on the strength that you specified. So you can see we kind of just made ourselves an instant little like sort of bridge or wall. And these the sides to this often look a little bit jagged. And so often when we run into these sort of resolution limits of the terrain, often that's where you would bring in a mesh that, like you would have seen this in things like Breath of the Wild or Fortnite or Skyrim or anything else. They'll often mask these by putting like little rock models along the side of it to make this cliff look like a bit more of a natural cliff. And we've probably got a few rock models that we can like try and do that with ourselves. No guarantees that it's going to look even vaguely correct, but it's the sort of thing where you can bring in little details, try and make this look a little bit more cliff-like. Rock assets are great for this sort of thing because you can stretch and like warp rock assets quite a bit before they start looking completely outlandish. And you can kind of start to make sort of slightly more natural looking boundaries on your terrain using meshes, if that's what you feel like doing. And so now we'll move on to probably one of the other most useful things that we can put on terrain, and that is trees. So that'll take us to the next panel in our terrain menu, which is the paint trees option. Now you'll see in the paint trees panel we don't get a brush. It just places trees within a certain density within the area inside the circle. But you'll notice that the first thing it tells us underneath how to paint trees is that we don't have any trees defined. So the first thing we need to do is click on our Edit Trees button so we can find ourselves a tree. Now, because this is Rec Room Studio, Rec Room is very helpfully already pre-prepared a couple of trees for us to use. Now, if you type in tree, sorry, not trees, just tree. Now, oddly enough, not all of the Rec Room tree objects are pre-set up to be trees. But I will walk you through how to set up the ones that aren't. But for now, we can take something like the tree pine. And now that we've added that, oh, hello. That's a lot of trees. Okay. So you'll notice the tree density by default is quite high. You'll want to drop that down a little bit. Now, one thing that's useful to note here is you can paint quite a few trees on your terrain, and performance won't suffer too badly, because under the hood, Studio will manage your trees. Wait, did someone say Fortnite? That's right, guys. If any game has trees in it, it is automatically Fortnite. Just so you know. Also, if you've covered up your meshes with cliffs, or your cliffs with meshes, rather. But we can, sorry, going back to our trees, we can dial down our tree density, and if you want to get more precise, you can also reduce the brush size so that you're placing trees in a far more specific way. Thank you, AK. That's an excellent summary. Diagrams make everything better. But you can see as we start to place trees around our landscape, that already this starts to look a lot less uniform and a little more interesting. Like, trees are just a very important part of landscape features. I realized I also have the tree height set to random. You can unlock that to make your trees a little shorter. So we can paint big trees, or we can paint little trees, or you can set it to if you set it to random, you have the option to, we have this weird little compound slider, which lets you set an upper and lower limit for random. Long boy. I didn't realize that was what that was going to do. And so you also have the option to unpair your width from the height. And so you can make your trees wider than they are tall, if that is a good fit for your tree asset. And so obviously trees let you add a lot of interesting variation to what you already have. And it's also worth noting that you don't have to use tree meshes for this. You can do this with any prefab that meets the requirements. And I'll walk you through what those requirements are now. So if we go ahead and hit Edit Tree, and we try and add another tree, and this time, even though this, you might have created a different looking landscape from me, but I'm going to try and import a palm tree, and even though this landscape doesn't look especially suitable for palm trees, it's just one of the most ready things to demonstrate the point. You'll see that if you try and bring in the palm tree, and you try and paint it, nothing happens. Now, this is rather unhelpful. But you'll see the only bit of, we aren't painting any trees here, and the only feedback we have that looks even vaguely like warning light is this little yellow triangle down here, which tells us that this tree does not have an LOD group. Which, they're correct, the tree doesn't have an LOD group. So to fix that, we'll hit the Edit Trees, and we'll hit the Edit Tree button. And we're just going to click on the tree prefab slot here, and that'll take us to where the tree prefab actually lives. Now, for the time being, we can close this. I'm going to click on our tree fab. Wow, you know, that works. We're going to click on our tree fab, double click, and this will take us into the magical blue prefab editing menu. I can't remember whether we've been here before or not, but if you do double click on a prefab and find yourself in this mystical blue land, don't despair. You can go back to where you were just by clicking the arrow that shows up at the top left of the hierarchy panel just underneath the plus button. But what we're doing when we are in this mythical blue land is we are editing a prefab. Now, it's worth noting that when you edit a prefab and you save the changes to that prefab, they are copied across to every other instance of that prefab in your scene. So if I change something on this palm tree, I don't have any palm trees in my scene yet, but when I change something here, it will change every other palm tree. And if I went and edited the prefab for that pine tree, it would also change every other pine tree. So the component that I mentioned before, that any object has to have on it in order to be used as a tree, is called an LOD group. Now I won't go into too much detail about what LODs are, but you'll see them in action as we set this up. So level of detail just means, so you know how we have the ink limit, right, in Rec Room? The ink limit is an approximation of how expensive it is to render or process a thing. In Studio we don't have ink, but we still need to manage our things that cost performance, which in this case is how detailed our models and textures are, like they were using ink. LOD groups are very helpful for this because as a model gets further away from the camera, they replace it with a less detailed version, because once that model is taking up a small part of the scene, you can't really see how detailed it is. So it does a clever little sleight of hand, and it will swap it out for something less detailed. But we have to actually tell it what those less detailed things are. So we add an LOD group to our model. You would have seen me do it before. You click Add Component, search for LOD, add an LOD group. And now from in here, we need to actually click on our little individual LOD segments. So if we click on our LOD0, LOD0 is our most detailed model. And you'll see a little renderers panel opens up here, and we can click Add. And you'll notice that what this is a list of objects in our prefab that have a mesh renderer attached to them already. And you'll see that they are conveniently already named LOD0, LOD1, and LOD2. So we're just going to assign them the way that they already are. So if we assign LOD0 as the renderer for the LOD0, if we click on our LOD1 section, we click Add, we choose LOD1, come back here. So just to clarify, we're adding that LOD component to the top level of our prefab, so it's the object right at the top. And then if we click on LOD2, click Add, we choose LOD2. Now, if you look at the little camera icon that appears on our little LOD panel, you'll notice that as we get further away, it actually scrolls along. And this little visual feedback here will tell us which model, pardon me, that it's currently rendering. And Rec Room's done their LODs very well. You're fine, Lexi. Take all the time you need. You can always look at the video afterwards. You'll see that these are done so well that we can't even really see the fact that it's swapping out to less detailed models as we get further away. But it's definitely happening, and that's why it tells us LOD1, LOD2. But now that we've set that up, so I won't go over creation of LODs. We might do that in the advanced class. But for now that we've actually added an LOD component to our tree fab, if we go back to our terrain, back to our paint trees, we should see that when we try and paint a palm tree, it actually appears. And you can make, now you would have seen that in the palm tree one we had 3 LODs for the one model, but you can paint anything as a tree on the terrain, so long as it has an LOD component at its root, and that has at least one mesh renderer assigned to it. But the reason, you don't need to get too worried about the performance cost of trees, even if you have a lot of them on your map. And you would have seen this on maps like Rec Royale that have trees everywhere, but still manage to run okay. The reason for that is the terrain will actually manage for you which trees need to appear at any given point in time. So it's only going to render trees that are close to you. And you can also, in the terrain settings panel, I know I said we weren't going to look at this much, but there is one more thing that is worth looking at, and that is just the maximum number of trees. So what will happen is the trees will automatically get less detailed as the camera moves further away. And also, if the terrain thinks that you've put too many trees in one place, it will actually start to get rid of trees that you're not looking at. So you can actually get incredibly tree happy on your maps without affecting the performance too much, which is one of the very useful things about terrain and why we don't just put the trees on the terrain as mesh prefabs. So now that we've looked into how to add terrain, or sorry, into how to add trees, you can see we've got a lot more visual variation in our setup already, having added some trees. But there are still some blotchy looking parts on our terrain that it might be nice to see if we can cover up. And for that, we have one more trick up our sleeves. But before I move on to that last trick that we have up our sleeves, does anybody have any questions about trees?
Okay, actually, real good question now that I had. I discovered that since I was far away from an area, I didn't see trees that I was putting down until I got close, and I got way too many palm trees in an area. Is there an easy way to get rid of these trees?
Control Z.
Well, it was a long time ago because, like I said, I couldn't see them because I painted them far away and they weren't spawning for me when I was flying around.
Okay, so if you want to delete all of the trees of a certain type, I mean, deleting any tree is something that we should go over. So you might have noticed that this is a bit of a pattern. But if most things that we place by clicking, we can press Control click to remove. And you can set your brush size for removing trees to much bigger, and it will remove them en masse. Although generally it'll only remove or place the kind of tree that you selected. So if you're removing pine trees, select pine tree first. Or if you're moving palm trees, select palm tree first.
Got it. Super beaver mode.
If you want to mass remove every version of a tree, you can go to edit tree and then remove the tree, which will obviously remove every instance of that tree. You'll just have to add it back again. So now I'll introduce you to the last trick that we have up our sleeves to add a bit more interesting variation to our terrain. And that is details. So details come in two varieties. We have texture details and we have mesh details. Now, very similar to trees, you'll notice that we don't have any of them defined by default. One difference to note with details is we do still get brushes for placing details. So we can use a brush to dictate the pattern that our terrain details get put down in. So to add ourselves a detail, just for demonstration's sake, we'll hit the Edit Details panel, and first we will choose to add a grass texture. Now this will open up a little dialog, and if we hit the button to select a grass texture, we'll open up our thing and we'll search for grass, which was imported by our little low poly nature pack that we imported before. And so we'll take this little grass texture here, and we'll double click on it. Now we have a few settings here that we can manipulate, like min width, min height, max height, noise spread, etc. They do pretty much exactly what they say on the label. So you don't generally need to mess with these settings too much. However, there is one thing that you will want to adjust. I don't know if any of you guys saw my first studio map, Fire Fracture. But one of the most common bits of feedback I got was there's little glitches on top of your grass. Like the grass goes up to where it should be, but then there's this tiny little textured line just above the top of it, and it looks weird. I finally found out what causes that, so I'm going to walk you through it now. So it's a very simple thing. But if you click on your grass texture, it will, when you paint our grass texture, it'll have that funny little layer on it, unless we go into our texture import settings and change the wrap mode from repeat to clamp. And then hit apply. Because what was happening to my grass before was that because the texture was set to be a repeating texture, even though it's only supposed to show up on the grass once, on each bit of grass once, it was trying to tile it. And so the tiny little bit of the bottom of the image would show up at the top of the grass, which just looks strange. But now that we've finalized that, we can press the add button. I'll dial down this brush size a little bit, but you can see that we start to paint little bits of grass around our terrain as we go. Now again, grass is one of those things that you can get pretty grass happy with your terrain, because again, the terrain under the hood will manage when grass is supposed to show up and when it isn't. You may find that in some cases, your grass gets a little bit dense. So if you need to, I believe in the you can also manually tweak detail distance and detail density if you do find that people on lower end platforms are struggling in your room. But generally, the default settings for detail painting will serve you pretty well. But you can definitely see that, like, as we add little bits of grass, like detail, onto our grass texture areas that we've painted, that it just starts to bring them to life a little bit more. Now, the other kind of detail we can add is very similar. We have the option to add a mesh detail. Well, just to quickly go over the brushes for details, it's pretty much exactly the same as any of the other brushes. You can set their size, you can set their opacity. If you set their opacity to higher, you will paint them more densely. And strength also does roughly the same thing. I'm not entirely sure why we have two separate controls for that, but it is what it is. So if we want to add ourselves a detail mesh, it works exactly the same as adding a texture, except rather than giving us a field for a texture to put in, it asks us for a mesh, or it asks us for a game object. So that'll give us a prefab. So again, like trees, this doesn't actually have to be a tree, and it doesn't actually have to be a piece of grass. And I'll demonstrate that real quick, because the only constraint for using a detail is that it has to have its mesh renderer, that prefab has to have its mesh renderer on the top layer. One thing that meets this criteria just happens to be the tomato mesh that we imported in the previous lesson. So just for fun, I'll use that as a demo here. I'll take the L on this one. Remember that when you add a new detail, you need to switch to that detail in the panel before it will show up. Now, it will give you a warning if you try and add a detail mesh that has too many vertices to it, because detail meshes are meant to be, you can see this tomato is pretty low poly, right? But detail meshes are meant to be even lower poly than this. But we'll keep it here for now, just because we can. You know, perfectly natural looking crop of tomatoes hiding in the grass. But again, there are plenty of other things that you can add using detail meshes, and detail meshes are really just for anything that is nice to have in terms of like making your scene look good, but you wouldn't miss it if it wasn't there. Don't put anything important to your scene as a detail mesh, but just background things like little shrubs, grass, trees, rocks. Any of these things make a good detail mesh. And we may even have I don't know why I looked for rocks plural there. Can even take, didn't add it. Oh, because I didn't press add. That would do it. You can go ahead and press add, and you can use it to add the little rocks here too. That is one thing that's worth noting. Textures will actually, details will be a little influenced by the texture underneath them. So in this particular case, you can see when I tried to paint my rocks, they've showed up bright green, because that is actually in my settings for this. If we look at our rock and we choose edit, you'll see we've got a healthy color and a dry color. Now in the case of healthy rocks, most healthy rock, I don't know how I tell a healthy rock from an unhealthy rock, but I'm imagining most green rocks may not be on the healthier side. We may want our rocks to be looking a little more gray. But then again, maybe we want them to be blue. I don't really need to dictate to the rocks how to live their best life. But just know that the two colors that you specify, when you paint these details, they will show up with a little bit of influence from the underlying texture. Now it's worth noting these rocks probably weren't a good example for this, only because that's one of a key difference between terrain and trees. Sorry, between terrain details and trees. Thanks, AK. Is that trees have collisions and details do not. Anything that you paint as a detail mesh, you can walk right through. But you'll find when you load into your room that any tree that you've placed, you will be able to walk into, and it will stop you from moving. But that more or less covers the addition of details to your terrain. that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. Kudos if you watched all the way through, and if you didn't, thanks all the same. This would not have happened without the encouragement of Freckleberry and the wonderful community over at the Berry Patch Discord. If you're interested in taking one of these classes in the future, or just down to meet a great group of people, you should totally join up. Link is in the description. What's up, gamers? Welcome to the recorded sessions for the second lesson of the Rec Room Basics class. My name is Cooks, and I'll be taking you through the content today, thanks to my co-teacher and editor and general maintainer of sanity, AKKR123. Be sure to check out their channel for more RRS tutorial goodies and just general shenanigans. So, without any further delays, let's get stuck into it.